Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good afternoon to everyone. Distinguished guest, Professor Kenney again, Professor Shad Saleem Faruqi, Professor Chandra Muzaffar, Elma Berisha, Dr. Faruq Musa, and others, friends of RRF, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending our another session, another discussion that we are going to have today on another critical and important topic as well that we are going to explore further, and it's not a new issue, it's not a new topic. So the tendency to perceive another religion or any other particular ideology or community group is not uncommon in history of human civilization, in particularly in perceiving in a negative way. This has happened before in other societies and communities, mentioning the tendency towards anti-Semitism, on racism, which has plagued the general global society over the past decades and even centuries. But one thing in particular that we want to touch now is the problem which relates to Islam and Muslim, mainly on Islamophobia. We understand that the negative perception towards Islam and also the Muslims in the term of Islamophobia has caused Muslims being perceived in a negative way, which relates Muslims and Islam to be a religion of violence, which relates to extremism, and in some ways also relates to backwardness. So what we can also understand what's happening quite frequently in the world now is some sense of discrimination towards Muslim and towards Islam, and in some occasion has also caused violence as well. So this is not just an issue which is a focus, which is of the concern among Muslims, maybe not so much in Malaysia, but I think it's a lot more important in the more global sense of the development of the Ummah and the Muslims. So to discuss the discussion today further, we want to discuss and ask the question, Islamophobia, is it actually getting worse now? So to have to discuss further on this discussion, our speakers would be Professor Kenney, Professor Shad Saleem Faruqi, and also Professor Chandra Muzaffar. To continue with the discussion further, I invite the moderator, Elma Berisha, to proceed with the talk. Thank you.
Very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to this IRF session on Islamophobia. Is it getting worse? 2 days ago, Al Jazeera News had post on a Palestinian youth killed in cold blood. His name was Arkan Mijar, aged 15. He was living in a camp with his family, but then he went to another camp of refugee camps. I guess this is like in thousands over there. People not having normal city or town life, but living in camps. Yet, he went to help, I guess, his grandmother, elderly grandmother. And the night before he was shot in cold blood, he called his father and he informed his father that he got some gifts for his younger sibling, and also he said emphatically a few times that I swear by God I love you, I swear by God I love you. And the father was feeling a little bit weird why he's saying that, and of course the next morning he got the news that Arkan was actually killed. You have this news almost every day in Al Jazeera, but you never have this kind of news in BBC or Guardian, or very, very rarely. And this kind of stories has been going on for years and for decades. And many of the people of the world are sort of tired and sick of the Palestinian issue to the degree that they don't watch the news anymore, because they feel very disempowered and powerless, and in a great despair of not being able to help in any way to resolve this conflict in a peaceful way. So one of the ways to deny this reality is by not watching the news at all, or perhaps by not even talking about these happenings. So the big question here is why the world allows the Palestinian genocide to go on and on and on for decades. How can this happen? The only answer or the only explanation would be the build-up Islamophobia, the narrative or the sentiment that has been going on also for decades. Some deny it, some compare it with the Red Scare or the communist propaganda in US and Europe during the Cold War. Some compare it with the Japanese discrimination during the Cold War and World War II. Some compare it with the Jewish discrimination during the European leading to the World War II period. Some academics and intellectuals, they actually find the roots of Islamophobia in historical times and in historical discourses such as Edward Said. The Orient, Raed Said, has helped to define Europe or the West as its contrasting image, an idea, personality, and experience. European culture gained its strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self. So basically the problem is deeper here, and it's not only deeper in terms of its causes, but it's also getting deeper and deeper every day for our modern and contemporary realities. So this is an issue, it's a big question, and today we have with us three intellectuals to discuss this question of if Islamophobia is actually in the rise, or is it simply a fiction to shut down the debate, as the global media seems sometimes to brush it off. A few words on our main speaker, Professor Jeffrey Kenney. He's a professor of religious studies at DePauw University, Indiana, United States. He's an expert of religious discourse, comparative religion, modern Islam, Islamism, religion and politics in the Muslim world, as well as radical religious groups in the Middle East. His areas of special interest and study are modern Islam in Egypt, religious interpretation in modern contexts, ways religion interacts with secularization, and most importantly, how people talk about Islam in contexts that don't seem to be religious at all. He has written many books, and currently he has been endorsed with an award to do research in Malaysia, and is writing a book about teaching comparative religion in Malaysia. I guess with this, I would like to invite Professor Jeffrey Kenney for his main speech. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elma, for that very overly kind introduction. I should, before I get started, give out all my other thanks, and that is to IRF for inviting me, Dr. Ahmed Faruq Musa, whose tireless efforts to get so many people to do so many things in a very short period of time, and I am happy to be part of those efforts. I appreciate it. And of course to the distinguished panelists who are here, and to everyone who's decided to take time out of their day. I'm happy to be here, although the topic itself is not a very happy one. Probably at no other time in history has Islamophobia been so prevalent in the lives of Muslims and non-Muslims as it is today. It has even surpassed, I'd say, what happened right immediately after 9/11. And if we can trust the survey data, it seems to have spiked even more recently than it was right after 9/11. The ease with which actors, especially political actors, seem to be able to conjure up fear and images of fear of Islam and Muslims probably speaks to the broad problem that we have of the politics of othering that is now a global phenomenon. It's not just, it's in Europe, it's in the US, it's everywhere, including, I would say, the Muslim world. For this reason, there's probably no better time to talk about the dynamics that feed into it and to try to kind of tease out some of the essential features for why it has become so popular. The point that I was trying to make is it getting worse? I think it's obvious that it's getting worse. It's far more blatant than it has ever been. It's far more intersectional, which means that the idea of Islamophobia or the idea of fear of Islam and Muslims is interconnected and intertwined with a lot of other issues that I think that people don't even consider because it's so automatic. Ideas have been played back in the public and in the media so often that there are a certain set of ideas that once they're even talked about, Islam and Muslims lie in the background of it. It's far more political now than I think it has been, and I think it's also far, far more accepted and normalized than it has been in the past. So just as a starting point, ostensibly the definition should not be that overly problematic, although it has become problematic because of the pushback of many people who want to deny Islamophobia. But an easy definition would be kind of an irrational fear and hatred of Islam, Muslims, and the acts that follow from these feelings. And as was mentioned before by Elma in her introduction, Islamophobia is often cast as a kind of new form of Orientalism and kind of a continuation of the view that Islam is the civilizational antithesis of the West. I would say that this probably fits in very well with, in some ways this is just a definition, but the problematic is in the US specifically and in Europe in general also, what we have is an attempt to both reject Islamophobia as an idea and to create the image that it is in fact a fiction, that Muslims have invented it to protect Islam, and that liberals in the West have invented it to protect Islam and to protect Muslims from any kind of criticism. And this is teamed up in the US especially, but in some cases in Europe, with a kind of rise of an atheist faction that is anti-theistic and wants to be able to be anti-theistic and anti-religion with all religion, and they fear that in some way Islamophobia means that they can't say anything critical of Islam, which of course is not what Islamophobia is. So those people who are trying to counter Islamophobia are not saying Islam can't be criticized, but what you have is this strange grouping of people who want to deny that it's even an issue, and I would say that this is actually part of the Islamophobia itself, and why it is such an important issue to talk about is because there's such focused and intentional pushback on the idea that it even is there. And people who want not just to talk about it that it isn't there, and here's the strange thing, is that they want to say they're Islamophobic and proud. So it's this dual kind of conception that it doesn't exist, it's a myth, but yes, we are Islamophobic and we should be Islamophobic and so should other people. So now granted these people are a minority, I think, in the West, but they are a very vocal minority and they push things in a given direction. The very fact that it is real, I think, can be confirmed by all the evidence that we have, both of reports, survey data, and analyses of what I would call to be very reliable organizations. The European Islamophobia report of 2017 talked about Islamophobia has become a danger to the foundation of the democratic order and values of the European Union. It has also become the main challenge to the social peace and coexistence of different cultures, religion, and ethnicities in Europe. This is a relatively recent, a recent survey and a recent report that came out. If you look at some of the other stats that have been published, that the spike in offenses, hate crimes against Muslims, which I should say are really part of a larger trend and a spike in hate crimes against everyone. So while we're talking about Islamophobia, the reality is that there has been a spike in hate crimes, both verbal crimes, verbal offenses of being attacked, and actual physical attacks. This has happened against just about every minority group that you could imagine. Muslims are just one among them. This is the survey from England and Wales. You can find the same thing, of course, in the US, what is often called the Trump effect, where the hate incidents that have occurred since his politicking for president and since his winning the election has increased dramatically across the board. Mexicans, gays, homosexuals, Muslims, Jews, you name it, the increase in hate crime has gone up, and it doesn't seem to be abating much. Also, and I thought it might be important to show this, is that the anti-Muslim assaults in the U.S. in particular have, in 2016, spiked above what it was right post 9/11. So these are actual hate crimes directed against Muslims in the U.S. And part of this has to do with a larger sense of the notion in the U.S., and this is also, we find this also in Europe, that many Westerners in general feel that in some sense Islamic values are not compatible with, are at odds with Western values. Surveys show this time and again. By the way, I should say they also show time and again that the people who tend to have these views have never met a Muslim, and who do not have Muslim friends, do not have Muslim neighbors. But because specifically in certain countries where the Muslim populations are not very large, this is data from the US, and as you can see, from the white evangelical Protestants, 73% would say that they agree that Islamic values do not comport with American values, with the American way of life, and the lowest number is non-Christian religion is 37%. So these are very significant numbers, and speak to the issue that people who don't know Muslims and don't know Islam tend to have these kind of stereotype notions. And when you have politicians such as Donald Trump saying, "I think Islam hates us," it's not surprising that these views are spread relatively easily and are expressed by others relatively easily. Now, what I want to talk about just briefly are like 4 what I take to be intersectional issues where the issue of Islam comes in even when Muslims are not necessarily involved. And I think one of these issues is, of course, migration. Obviously there has been an influx, especially given the wars, the problems in the civil wars in the Middle East following the Arab Spring. And there have been a lot of people moving into Europe. And so yes, the numbers there have increased, there's no doubt about that. And one could argue that migration, no matter what the time frame, always leads to a certain backlash that you don't want new people coming in. And there's a notion that new people are a threat in some cases. This is the history, by the way, of migration in the US, from when Catholics came in, from when Jews came in. It's just a history of, it's a pattern of rejecting new people who are coming in. But in Europe, this is not just a matter of people, and it's not just a matter of people who are taking up social services and who are taxing the social service system. This all much of it gets funneled into, this is a problem with Islam. And that this is a problem with these people who are not going to, the signs and the protests, Stop Islam, immigration invasion, the notion that rape refugees, the notion that Muslims are a threat. It's rampant there. It's also somewhat rampant in the US, that has been combined with the building of the wall between the US and Mexico, which our current president claims the Mexicans are going to build for us. And it kind of all gets blurred together, the fear of cultural difference, the fear of migrants coming in, the fear of terrorism, the fear that somehow we have lost security and that the migrants are a demonstration of this. It all kind of becomes one big blur, and it's not that it all gets blamed on Islam and Muslims, but they become part and parcel of the mix. The other part of this, which I wish I could say that this was just Europe and Eastern European countries, but this has also clearly infected my own country, the US, of populist nationalism. There is a kind of retrenching in many countries, a sense that other places and other people are something to worry about. We need secure borders. We need to, in Trump's words, it's America first, even at the expense of others. This has really led to some very strange morphing of alliances, especially in Europe. This photograph here on your lower left is a picture of a young man who is actually the leader of an organization which is a gay-friendly Islamophobic organization, and that even so populist groups that would have typically been anti-gay, anti-lesbian, are now embracing them in their own way, and these people are out there talking about the fear of Islam and the fear of immigrants. It's almost like you choose somebody who might have been the other 2 weeks ago is now not the other because there's somebody who's a bigger danger. Now, of course, whether people like this could feel safe in another 2 years is another matter altogether, but it just goes to show the way in which politics has shifted, and some populist organizations on the right, which would have typically rejected people like this from participating, are now trying to find a way to embrace them. Might say it's rather cynical, and of course it's quite cynical. It's very cynical. The other kind of intersectional issue with migration is women. And the strange thing about the issue of women is that it works so many different ways. And by the way, this really has nothing to do with the concern about women. It has to do with the use and the symbolic use of women by different factions. And one way, of course, is to show that somehow Muslim women do not fit in to the way of life in the West. Their dress is an example of this. And the other way, and by the way, this is happening so much in the US, it's almost embarrassing, in which we use people who used to be Muslims and have converted to a different religion, typically Christianity, and use them as the source of information about Islam. Who confirm, for example, that, of course, Muslim men abuse Muslim women, that Muslim women are somehow being oppressed, and their clothing is a sign of this. This is something that is happening quite a bit. So it's both Muslim women themselves don't fit in. Muslim women themselves are being abused by their husbands who are really, of course, the true followers of Islam, and they're abusing Muslim women. And then there's also the idea that, of course, white women in Europe should be afraid of the Muslim male immigrant who's come in. And they're a threat to white women, to Western women. And this is also something that's been played up. So it's like, again, this is not about women. It's not about the safety of women. This is about how women can be used in the media to kind of depict Islam and depict Muslims. And of course, the other issue that is perhaps the largest issue is terrorism or extremism, and the way in which this gets linked directly to Muslims and Islam. It's the one-sided portrayal that there is typically never any cause for a Muslim to be violent. There's no contextualization of extremism. It's simply that somehow the religion itself is promoting terrorism and is a violent religion. I can tell you that over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, I teach an Introduction to Islam class. The number of students in my classes who have been, I would say, kind of pre-programmed by news media, by their parents and by their churches to automatically light onto issues in my class that I'm trying to teach the historical context for things, and they immediately light on to the fact that Islam must be a religion of violence. No matter how much I try to contextualize the use and the idea of jihad in the medieval context, in the classical context, it's a constant drone. And I would say that both violence and the women's issue are constantly on the mind of students who have these assumptions. And again, I think a lot of these assumptions have been built in by the media. They come in, and no matter how much effort I try to use to try to debunk this without turning the course into an apologetics course, it's very, very difficult to do. And in fact, at the end, I just got my student evaluations 2 or 3 weeks ago from the spring class, and I actually had 2 or 3 students say, we don't know why this class, which by the way is an intro to Islam that goes from like 600 to the present day, they were wondering why we didn't spend more time in jihad. Given its dominance, we needed to spend more time with jihad. This was the concern. Now, the other thing that I think is important to note about the terrorism issue is that there is very, very little talk and certainly very little analysis made for what's happening in the Muslim majority world and for the interventions of Western powers, specifically the US, in the Middle East, that creates pain and suffering for Muslims, and that may create backlash for violence among Muslims. So there's no contextualization of this, and it's almost as if the West or the US is not involved in this at all, that somehow terrorism arises out of nothing, that violence arises out of nothing. And when it arises out of nothing, it becomes a kind of essentialist notion of what lies with Islam. And it's like, it's very much like, for those of you who might remember this, post 9/11, when in America, the book that actually spiked in the charts for what people wanted to read in a way to try to explain to them 9/11 was the Quran. They thought that somehow by reading the Quran, they were going to find out why 9/11 happened. I don't think that has really abated much, unfortunately. I think it's still an equation that goes on in people's minds. Now, the reason I'm throwing this in here because it's one of those strange phenomenon that so many people are worried about terrorism in the U.S. in particular, and they're worried about foreigners coming in, and they're worried about Muslims. But if you look at the stats for the number of people who have been killed by gun violence in the U.S. as compared to terrorist incidents, it's not even a legitimate, I mean, it's almost absurd. But people focus on the terrorism incidences, and the issue of gun violence, even though it keeps getting brought up and incident after incident after incident happened, we do nothing about it. We're going to build a wall, we're going to ban Muslims, certain Muslims from certain countries from coming into the US, but when it comes to gun violence, there's no discussion. Now, and in my view, this is a very, very cynical ploy, and it's a very cynical way in which you can see that capitalist interests win out in these kind of contexts, and in which the lobbying of groups like the National Rifle Association pressurize politicians I mean, it's almost like they're pointing people in a different direction. It's not guns, it's people who create violence. And finally, I should just point out what we have is some rather strange Islamophobic bedfellows I mean, who would have thought that this kind of, and I know some of you might remember this meeting that happened in Riyadh, where you see Sisi, the president of Egypt, the king of Saudi Arabia, and Donald Trump, all kind of cavorting with their hands on this glowing globe. And this is what I find so in some ways so offensive, is that he is otherwise a very anti-Muslim, anti-Islam person. He goes here and participates in events, and they're also, at the same time that they're talking about, they're talking about the war on terror, they're talking about fighting extremism, and at the same time they're also, of course, as Donald Trump is there, he's there to sell military weapons. He's there to sell arms to the Saudis. So there's kind of strange combination of, here's a man who's supposedly representing a democratic country, is in bed with authoritarian rulers because it's very convenient and because they're essentially supporting the military-industrial complex in the US. And he's also talking to people who themselves are, in a sense, participating in their own versions of Islamophobia by attacking Shias and by attacking and somehow, in this, you need a roadmap actually to sort out the history of the Saudi Arabian relationship with the Muslim Brothers. In and of itself, it requires its own set of studies because Saudi Arabia's ups and downs with the Muslim Brotherhood over the years, and now of course the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamism is on the wane and they're enemies of Islam. They're all terrorists, despite the fact that in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood Party was the first party ever elected in a democratic election in Egypt, and now of course the Muslim Brotherhood is banned. How do you, I mean, this is the strange political world that we're now living in, where there is a kind of Islamophobia of convenience for certain Muslim leaders, and there's definitely an Islamophobia of convenience for leaders in the West. I should say that there is good news, and that is there is a great deal of opposition. There's a great deal of pushback by liberal and progressive organizations in the US. It doesn't get covered much in the press, I should tell you that. And there is a great deal of pushback by organized American Muslim groups that are trying to bring this to the attention. And not surprisingly, that doesn't get the attention of the press either. It's a kind of selective issue of what gets the attention of the press. But it's out there, and it's happening on campuses quite a bit, and it is there. But unfortunately, I think in some cases, the loudest voices and the ugliest voices are the ones that often win out in this debate, and that happens to be the people who are really promoting Islamophobia. Now, the other bit of good news, I think, and it goes back to something I mentioned a minute ago, and that is the fact that what we can tell from the statistics is that people's ideas about Muslims improve, about Muslims and Islam improve, if they know someone of the Islamic faith. So people who know Muslims tend not to have Islamophobic views. And what I thought was interesting was the Gallup survey group that does polling throughout the world, by the way, came up with a kind of a classification, tripartite classification that had to do with Islamophobia. And I think it's worth just thinking about this in a sense, because they classified people into three rough and ready groups: the isolated, the tolerant, and the integrated. And the isolated tend not to be members of any particular faith group, but if they are, they tend to believe in the truth of their own perspective above all others. The tolerant have a live and let live attitude toward people of other faiths and treat people with respect, but they are not likely to learn about other religions. They know they're out there, they respect them, but they're not they're not going to go across the street and introduce themselves to the local people at the mosque. And then the integrated have a live and let live attitude and actively seek to know more and learn from others of different faiths. And so I think what we could take away from this is that Islamophobia can clearly be decreased to the extent that we move people in ways that I think is going to require education, of course. We move people from the isolated into the tolerant, and people from the tolerant into the integrated. This is not an easy thing to do. I would say that even in my own teaching, I run up against this problem. I like to think that in the classes that I teach, I'm trying to get people to see the world from the Islamic perspective, to have a kind of dual vision of things, to be able to understand and to be able to empathize. But I think people are actually working against the grain of a lot of training and a lot of counter-education that makes it very, very difficult for them to see Muslims and Islam in a different light. And with that, I think I will turn it over to others.